Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Grounded podcast with Pastor Matt Round. This is episode 26, and Pastor Matt's back from his little break, thankfully. Today, we are going to be answering the question, what is the best way to approach someone about Christ? It's a very important question.
You thankful that I took a break, or are you thankful that I'm back?
No, I'm thankful that you're back. Very thankful that you're back. No, we needed you and we missed you.
No, it's good of you to fill in. Thanks. I'm sure the people were blessed by it. And like I said, we'll get you in front of the mic more often, or at least get you active on the mic more often. Did you have fun?
Yeah, but it's very hard to listen to yourself.
It's murder. It's the worst thing.
Like I remember when I asked you if you had listened to, like, after we did like the first two episodes, I asked you, did you listen to them? And you were like, no, I could never.
No,
listen to it.
I hate listening.
And now I know.
I don't know how
so
you
bad.
people do it every week in church. No, it's a nightmare.
It's really bad.
Well, the good news is it never gets any easier. So there's that going for you. So in your next episodes, you still won't like listening to yourself, but it's all right. I like listening to it. So you're fine. You asked a question somewhere in there, I'm pretty sure. What's the best way to approach someone about Christ? Question that comes from one of our listeners, and it's a great question. It's a question that I think a lot of Christians are and rightly should be concerned with, because we know that God has called us to one purpose, really. The church was left on earth to make disciples. Jesus says, go and make disciples, teaching, baptizing. So we know that that's a part of who we are, that we are to approach others with the gospel of Jesus Christ. But how do we do that? And while I can't exhaustively give you, well, this is what it looks like in this situation, I don't think it's nearly as complicated as we sometimes make it. So I'm going to give you kind of three big ideas for how to approach people with the gospel, for how to approach someone about Christ. And they're probably not going to be the three that you want to hear, because I think people want the list of this is how you approach this situation. But bear with me, and if there's follow-up questions, as always, send them in, and we'll answer them, and we'll go deeper on any of these things that we need to. But when we're talking about approaching someone with Christ, we're talking about the idea of being a witness for Christ, a common thing that we use. But before we even get into the three things for how to approach that or how to think about that, I want to get around, first of all, that idea of being a witness. In order to be a witness in a court case, what do you need, Noah? See, this is a real question now. We'll get some back and forth, and we'll get you on the mic more. If I'm going to be a witness in a court case, what do I need?
Well, you need to have been there.
All right, so you need to have been there. I didn't even prep him on that, folks. You need to have been there. You need to be a firsthand eyewitness. You need to know the facts, and you have to be involved in the situation. I cannot be a witness for something that I have no firsthand knowledge of. At least I shouldn't be a witness of something I have no firsthand knowledge of. So when it comes to approaching people with Christ, the first thing, and I don't ever want to stray too far away from this, is you need to have interacted with the gospel yourself. You cannot simply say that because I've been in church for X number of years that I am now qualified to be a witness about Christ. You might know a whole bunch of facts about Jesus and the Bible. You might be able to say some true theological things. But when it comes to the testimony of who Christ is and why it matters, first of all, make sure that it's applied to your own life. To be an effective witness, and that's what we're talking about, to be an effective gospel-presenting believer, you need to be a believer. You need to have an understanding of who God is and what your sin has done to break that relationship. You need to have an understanding of who Christ is and how he has paid the penalty for your sin. You need to have an understanding of things like the resurrection and your hope in eternal life with Christ, because otherwise your best hope is trying to make more moral people. And that's not what the gospel is about. Does the gospel bring moral change? Absolutely it does. But we are not trying to make better people. We are not trying to make people who have better families or who make better financial decisions or who are generally kinder or nicer or more patient. Those are good things. Those are not the main thing. So when it comes to being able to approach someone about Christ, sadly, I think many people struggle because they've never actually wrestled with the truth of the gospel in their own life. So that's just a freebie. That's point zero. When it comes to the best way to approach someone about Christ, first of all, understand and make sure that you have approached Christ rightly, that you have come to him for forgiveness, that you, through Christ, have been reconciled to God. So that's the place where you have to start. But then how do you approach someone with Christ? Well, the first thing is you need to preach the gospel. There is a common saying that varies slightly, but it's essentially preach the gospel at all times, and when necessary, use words. And it's usually attributed to Thomas Aquinas or Francis of Assisi or somebody way back, way far away. None of them ever said it. That is not a quote out of church history because it's really biblically completely inaccurate. When it comes to approaching someone with the gospel, you need to speak. When you ask the question, what's the best way to approach someone about Christ? It is to actually approach them with Christ. Now, your behavior, your lifestyle, those things matter. And we'll get into that in a bit. But the foundational principle is not about how do I become friends with someone so that I might share the gospel. When we're talking about approaching someone with Christ, we are called to preach the gospel at all times, period. That's the end of the sentence. Romans 10. We might as well start there. Romans 10, verse 9 says that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart man believes, resulting in righteousness, and with the mouth he confesses, resulting in salvation. So we know that is the heart response toward the gospel. That is how you are saved. Confession and belief. But how do you get there? Well, later on in that same chapter, in Romans 10, verse 13, Paul writes, for whoever will call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. And then in verse 14, he says, how then shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe in him in whom they have not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? And how shall they preach unless they are sent, just as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring glad tidings of good things. Now, of course, in the context, he's actually referring to Israel and the fact that they did hear these good things. Israel doesn't have an excuse for their unbelief. But the content of what he's saying remains true. You cannot call on the one who you don't believe, and you can't believe in the one that you haven't heard about, and you don't get to hear without a preacher. No one is saved by viewing the good works of someone else exclusively. Good behavior never actually preached the gospel to anyone, and that's contrary kind of to where our culture is at. We think that if we do enough good things, and if we're nice enough, and if we're kind enough, and if we're patient enough, and if we're gentle enough, somehow somebody is going to get a hold of the gospel message. And the fact is, nobody gets a hold of the gospel message until they hear the gospel message. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, flip over there, Paul is writing to that church that was a mess in lots of different areas and lots of different ways. But as Paul writes to them in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 1, he says, now I make known to you, brethren, the gospel which I preached to you, which you also received, in which you also stand, by which you're saved, if you hold fast to the words that I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. This is how you're saved. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. And he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, and then he appeared to more than 500 at one time. And he goes through all of these things as he's setting up the whole hope of the resurrection that is the rest of chapter 15. But he says, this is the foundational thing that you need to understand, that you need to be saved, that Christ died according to the Scriptures. That Christ died for sins, according to the Scriptures, that he was buried and that he was raised again. Paul says first importance is the gospel. The Corinthian church needed a whole bunch of stuff, didn't they? They needed a whole bunch of specific teaching on how to put their faith into practice. But Paul says, what I gave you first and foremost was the saving message of the gospel. People do not need to know how they can be better people. People need to know how they can be reconciled to a holy God so that they might spend eternity with him. So how do I approach someone with Christ? You preach the gospel because the gospel is what regenerates the heart. And we'll get into that in a second. And you actually use words. And when it comes to using words, how do you approach someone with Christ? I think we can get into a little bit of detail here. Don't get sidetracked. So often when we're in conversations with someone, spiritual conversations, we have a tendency to follow the rabbit trail of where the conversation goes. The finer points of creation versus evolution. And by the way, that matters. The doctrinal distinctives between Christianity or Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses. And we can have long conversations with those well-dressed people that come to our door. And the danger is we can have long conversations about spiritual things without ever actually getting to the gospel. Should you have reasoned and thoughtful answers for things? Absolutely. 100%. Christianity is not only a reasonable faith, it is the only absolutely always applicable, consistent worldview. But don't lose the gospel for the sake of an argument. And that's also really comforting, because that brings us into our next point. And that is, not only should you preach the gospel, but the best way to approach someone about Jesus Christ is to rely on the power of the gospel. So often we want to make winning people to Christ a matter of personality or presentation or training. And personality is important. Presentation, it matters how you speak. Training is important. You need to know things. But again, there's a point where all of those things can become the object rather than those things that simply convey the object, which is the gospel. Your presentation or my presentation, your intellect or my intellect, your training or my training have never actually won anyone to Christ, because my arguments aren't what save people. I might be the most brilliant logician out there. I might be the most eloquent speaker out there. Obviously, I'm not. But those things don't save anybody. I might be the most charismatic, outgoing preacher, able to connect with people on an emotional level, and that doesn't save anybody. In Romans chapter 1, Paul's very clear about what does save people. In Romans chapter 1, verse 16, he says, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek." The power of God for salvation is the gospel, not the preacher. It's the message, not the vehicle of the message. So as you're moving into these situations where you're asking, how should I approach people? You approach people humbly and confidently, knowing that it's the gospel that changes people and not you, which means you can talk to that double doctorate in astrophysics or that humanities or philosophy professor, not as an intellectual equal, but you're not called to win an intellectual argument. You come to them proclaiming the truth of the gospel, and that takes away the fear that I have to know every finer point of that person's particular heresy before I can engage them with Christianity, when the reality is what they need is not an intellectual persuasion. What they need is a heart transformation that only comes from the gospel. And then you say, well, if I do get into those arguments, there's a chance that I'll look foolish. The great news is your message is already foolish. There is nothing that you can do to make a darkened heart and mind think that the gospel makes sense. And we know that because that's what God's word tells us. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18, Paul says it this way. He says, "For the word of the cross to those who are perishing is foolishness, but to those who are being saved, it is the power of God. To those who are perishing, lost and dead in their sin, the cross is foolishness." So why did God give us a foolish message? Well, Paul says, "For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the cleverness of the clever I will set aside. Where is the wise man? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not come to know God, God was well pleased through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe." God actually uses the weak, the foolish, to present his glorious message of the gospel, because all the glory then goes to him. He says in 1 Corinthians 1, 22, "For indeed Jews ask for signs, Greeks search for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, to Jews a stumbling block and to Gentiles foolishness. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men." Can you imagine if approaching people with the gospel really did depend on you and your strength and your wisdom and your ability? What a terrible, unbearable burden that would be. And so often we're silent when it comes to the gospel, because that's the power we take on ourselves, as if we had the ability to change people. Christian, remember, when you preach Christ, you preach a message of foolishness. You preach a stumbling block. You preach something that doesn't make sense, but you preach the only thing that can save. And every time we see a sinner's heart transformed, every time we see the gospel do its work, it's another reminder that, first of all, God alone is mighty to save, and second of all, that God has called people to himself. Again, not only would it be hopeless if the power depended on me, but it would be hopeless if we didn't know. It would be hopeless if we didn't know whether God had called people to himself or not, if God had just left kind of a neutral humanity and maybe some will come and maybe they won't. It is a comforting thing to understand that there are those that God has called. And whatever their intellectual ability is, your simple message of the gospel, God's message of the gospel, that is foolishness to those who are perishing, will be the power of God to radically transform their hearts. So how do I approach someone about Christ? Well, first of all, you approach them with the gospel. Second of all, you approach them in confidence of just the gospel. Not your own ways, not your own wisdom, not your own words, not your own attempts to make it palatable. The gospel doesn't need to be contextualized. The gospel doesn't need to be softened. It doesn't need to be toned down. It doesn't need to be made enticing. The gospel needs to be made clear. And now that brings us to the third kind of foundational approach here, and that's that you need to be living in a way that demonstrates the power of the gospel. The gospel message saves. And there are some foolish preachers who have preached the gospel, and the gospel has done its work. There are failed people who have preached the accurate gospel, and the gospel does its work, because again, the power is not in the preacher, it's in the message. But if you want to know how to approach people with Christ, if you want to be an effective witness for Christ, you need to live in a way that demonstrates the changing power of the gospel that you say you believe in. This does not mean that you live perfectly. The world is quick to point out that Christians are hypocrites. A hypocrite is someone who says they do nothing wrong. I don't know of a single genuine Christian that would say they do nothing wrong. Built into Christianity is the understanding that we are ruined sinners saved by grace. Built into genuine Christianity is the constant recognition of sin, putting sin to death, and responding in humility and the desire for forgiveness. So again, that tends to be kind of a straw man argument that Christians are hypocrites. We're not hypocrites, we're sinners. And there's a difference. But you do need to be someone, to be an effective witness, you need to be someone whose life is being transformed by that gospel power. What does that look like? Well, we go to Galatians 5 and we see the fruit of the Spirit, and we know that in Galatians 5. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. We know that those things should be evident in our life. And the reality is that if you are living in a way that doesn't produce those things, the gospel is going to seem not only foolish, but the gospel is going to seem ineffective. Because how can I preach about a patient God, a forgiving God, that doesn't produce patience and forgiveness in his people? Well, the reality is God does that. And so we need to ensure, and again, this is so far beyond the, well, how do I talk to my friend about Christ? Preach Christ and be obedient. And that's what you're called to, and then God will accomplish his purposes. As Peter is writing in 1 Peter chapter 2, he's writing to a people that are suffering in various capacities. He's reminding them of the genuineness and the preciousness of their faith. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 13, he says, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right." He says, "For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men." Foolish men, fallen men, act in sinful, foolish ignorance. We should expect nothing less from an unredeemed, untransformed heart. One of the ways that you demonstrate, again, not your personal value or wisdom, one of the ways you demonstrate the impact of the gospel is in how you submit to others. Peter goes on in 1 Peter 2:17, "Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only those who are good and gentle, but also those who are unreasonable." Why? "For this finds favor. If for the sake of the conscience toward God, a man bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly." Peter says you demonstrate the power of the gospel in the way that you suffer. Not only in the way that you submit, but in the way that you suffer. And you say, well, that's not fair to suffer unjustly. Well, that's why Peter goes on to give Christ as the ultimate example of unjust suffering, who suffered in a way that was completely unfair, unjust, but also in a way that was completely holy and dependent on the Father. He goes on in chapter 3 to talk about wives submitting to their husbands. Ultimately, in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, he says, "Sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence." So much in that verse. Sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account. Some people take this verse and they say, well, I'll be ready to say something as soon as people ask. Again, that negates the whole biblical example of the outward intentional profession of the gospel. The disciples did not wait until people asked to present the gospel to them. What Peter's talking about is not that you have to wait. It's that the gospel ought to have such an impact in your life that there is such a clear distinction that people are compelled to ask. And the problem is we wonder why nobody asks about our faith. And the reality is quite often we're not living out a faith that makes anyone wonder anything. We look so much like the world that why would they ask any questions? How do I approach someone with Christ? How do I become an effective witness? Well, your life alone is not a presentation of the gospel, but your life will demonstrate the power of the gospel to those who are watching. That's why he says in verse 16, "Keep a good conscience, so that in the thing in which you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame." You need to live in a way that validates the gospel. The way that you live, once again, is not the power of the gospel. The way that you live is not in and of itself a presentation of the gospel, but the way that you live will show the strength and the power and the validity of the gospel in your own life. It will be a living example of what the gospel does, and the world will find that foolish. The world will find that inexplicable, but to those who are being called, they will find it compelling. And it can be, again, another tool that God uses to draw people to himself. And it can give you a platform and a place to share the gospel. Do you need to be friends with someone to share the gospel? Should we approach evangelism as relationship evangelism? Sort of yes, and then absolutely no. Again, the apostles, the prophets, they didn't wait until they had a relationship with someone built up to speak the truth. They spoke the truth, and then they lived obediently. How long do you have to wait to be a friend with someone before you tell them about Christ? Well, if you truly love someone and you knew that should their appointed days run out, then wouldn't the loving thing be to tell them about Christ? And since I don't know how many days they have left, the best friend that I can be is to tell them the truth about who Christ is as early as possible, if you want to define friendship that way. If you want to define friendship as just being comfortable and close with someone, then that's a different definition of friendship. And the problem is the longer you're friends with someone without actually proclaiming Christ to them, you find that it gets harder, not easier. Because then you wonder, well, why didn't you say anything before? Which is the valid question. So do you need a relationship to share Christ? No. Should you pursue Christ likeness in all your relationships? Absolutely. So there's that tension and that balance there. So then those are three principles that you can kind of use to when to approach and how to approach someone about Christ. Clearly, humbly, relying on the power of God, obediently in your own life, with a clear conscience, and like he said, with gentleness and reverence. The gospel is a message of confrontation at its core. It confronts the sinner in their sin with the fact of a holy God that they are eternally separated from. That message is offensive. The messenger should never be offensive. We plead with people. We call them to respond to the God who in his patience has given them life and breath for another day, that perhaps today might be the day that they respond to that gospel message. So go and proclaim the gospel. Rely on the power of the gospel. Live out the power of the gospel. And as you plead with people, do it in gentleness and reverence.
Thank you very much, Pastor Matt, for tackling that for us concisely and in great detail. We really appreciate it. And we appreciate that you're back. And thank you very much for listening to this episode of Grounded. Next week, we'll be back tackling another question as usual, hopefully get into that routine again. If you have any questions of your own, please email us, groundedwithmattround@gmail.com, and visit our website where you can view articles on each episode. We try and get them out when they come out, but sometimes it gets busy, so we don't have time to write them, but that's okay. So yeah, visit our website, groundedwithmatt.com, where you can view all that, and we'll see you next week.